They thought they were untouchable, the greatest engineers on Earth. Men who had built weapons that screamed through the sky faster than thunder, machines that could outfly, outshoot, and outclimb anything the Allies had. Inside the laboratories of the Third Reich, deep under concrete bunkers and hidden mountain facilities, German scientists whispered that they had already seen the future. They called it the Jet Age. By 1944, their pride had a name, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was sleek, fast, and unstoppable, at least that's what Berlin claimed. The Nazis believed that once these jets filled the skies, the war would turn overnight. But pride has a way of blinding men. Because even as those engines roared above Europe, the Reich itself was burning below. In the chaos of defeat, one thing became clear. Germany had reached for the future, but only managed to touch the edge of it. When the Allies swept through Germany in 1945, they didn't just find broken tanks and bombed-out cities, they found workshops of wonder. Hidden airfields filled with strange shapes, aircraft without propellers. Underground labs lined with blueprints of rockets, missiles, and engines unlike anything the world had seen. Some called it mad science. Others, genius born from desperation. And among these treasures lay one of the most important discoveries of the entire war. The jet engines of Nazi Germany. When American forces loaded those engines onto ships bound for the United States, they knew they were carrying more than metal. They were carrying secrets, the kind that could shape the next century. Months later, in a quiet hangar at Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers gathered around a large wooden crate. On its side, stenciled in fading black paint, were German words, Jumo 004 Hockeyheim, top secret. Inside was the heart of the Me 262, the first engine to push a man into the age of the jet. As the crate opened, the room fell silent. The engine was scarred, dented, but magnificent. A tangle of metal vanes and turbine blades, still smelling faintly of burnt oil and war. For years, Allied intelligence had heard rumors that German technology was decades ahead, that they had discovered something beyond comprehension. Now, standing before this machine, America was about to find out the truth. When the technicians began to disassemble it, they were astonished. The design was brilliant, elegant in theory, simple in construction. Every piece had purpose. Every valve, every bolt, every curve screamed of efficiency. But then came the surprises. The turbine blades, the soul of any jet engine, were not made of the high-temperature alloys the Americans expected. They were made of poor-grade steel, crude, brittle, and doomed to fail under stress. One engineer turned to his supervisor and whispered, "This thing, it's genius, but it's dying." The Americans realized what that meant. Germany hadn't built these engines out of choice. They'd built them out of necessity. Cut off from key resources, starved by blockade, crippled by Allied bombing, they had used what they had. And somehow, against all odds, they made it fly. That was both impressive and terrifying. Because if this level of innovation was possible under ruin, what could they have built if the war had gone differently? The Americans worked day and night, documenting every nut and bolt. Engineers from General Electric and Pratt and Whitney filled notebooks with sketches and measurements. They studied how the Germans had simplified production, how they could build something so advanced so quickly with so little. But as they dug deeper, the picture grew clearer. The Jumo 004 wasn't a miracle of perfection, it was a miracle of survival. Its lifespan, barely 25 hours of flight. Its maintenance, nightmarish. Its efficiency, crippled by materials that melted at high speed. It was a glimpse of the future through the lens of desperation. And yet, the Americans respected it, because it showed just how far human ingenuity could go when cornered by war. A few months later, word came from Washington. The captured German engineers were to be brought to America. Not as prisoners, but as assets. Under the top-secret program Operation Paperclip, scientists from the Third Reich were quietly relocated to the United States, to share their knowledge, to teach, to build. Some had worked on rockets, others on aerodynamics, and a few on jet propulsion. When these men, the same ones who had once worked under Hitler's eagle banners, arrived in America, they carried both arrogance and curiosity. They believed that no one could match their technical brilliance, that the Americans had simply copied their work. Until the day they were invited into a hangar at Muroc Army Airfield, California, a place that would one day be called Edwards Air Force Base. There, under the scorching desert light, the Americans unveiled their secret. A silver aircraft sat gleaming on the tarmac. Smooth, sharp, propellerless, the Bell XP-59A Aerocomet, America's first jet fighter. The German scientists froze. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Finally, one murmured in disbelief. They built this themselves? An American officer nodded. Yes, we started in 1941. Silence. The Germans looked at each other, their pride crumbling. While their nation had been tearing itself apart, America had quietly been building the same future, in secret, in peace, with precision. And the more they saw, the worse it got. Because the American engine, developed in partnership with the British Rolls-Royce, was smoother, cleaner, and infinitely more reliable. It didn't seize. It didn't melt. It didn't die after 25 hours. The Americans had taken the same idea and perfected it. One German engineer wrote later, "In the Reich, we built engines for victory. In America, they built engines for eternity." That was the day the illusion shattered. For years, the Nazis had called America a nation of dreamers, of weak minds and soft hands. But when these scientists walked through those hangars, when they saw assembly lines that stretched for miles, when they watched American mechanics testing engines that ran flawlessly for days, they understood the truth. They hadn't lost to inferior men. They had lost to superior organization, to freedom, to a system that didn't demand obedience, but excellence. And deep down, they knew something that no war propaganda could ever hide again. The future didn't belong to tyranny. It belonged to those who built, not to destroy but to advance. When the German scientists first stepped inside the American test hangars, they felt something they hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not awe, something else. Humility. These were men who had designed machines that pushed the limits of human flight. They had believed no one could rival their precision, their science, their daring. But standing in those hangars, surrounded by American engineers in coveralls, laughing, adjusting instruments, and running tests with a calm confidence, they realized they had entered a different world. The Americans weren't improvising. They weren't experimenting out of desperation. They were refining, polishing, perfecting. Every tool was in its place. Every measurement double-checked. Every note logged neatly in ink, not pencil. The Germans had expected chaos. Instead, they found rhythm. A rhythm of efficiency so natural it was almost beautiful. One of them, a jet propulsion expert named Dr. Helmut Behrens, whispered to a colleague, "In Germany, we chased progress through fear. Here, they chase it through discipline." The Americans were courteous but cautious. They asked questions, lots of them, but they never revealed too much. At least not at first. Until one morning, a U.S. Air Force colonel approached the group with a quiet smile. "Gentlemen," he said, "if you want to see what comes next, follow me." He led them to a long, sealed building at the edge of the base. Inside was something that made even the proudest among them go silent. A jet engine larger, cleaner, and smoother than anything they had ever built. Its serial number read, General Electric I-40. The Germans moved closer, tracing their fingers along the polished metal. The turbine blades shimmered under the lights, each one a perfect curve of nickel-chrome alloy, the kind of heat-resistant metal they could only dream of during the war. One scientist murmured, This could run for 100 hours. An American engineer chuckled. Try 200. For a long moment no one spoke, because in that single sentence the Germans understood everything. It wasn't just that America had caught up. It was that they had leaped ahead. The Americans hadn't copied the German designs, they had learned from them. They had taken the weaknesses of the Jumo 004 and turned them into strengths. Better metals, better cooling, better everything. While the Reich had spent its final years cannibalizing factories to survive, America had been building foundations. And this, the I-40, was only the beginning. Days later, the Germans were shown another project. a sleek, knife-like airframe sitting under a tarp. When the cover was pulled away, the sight nearly stole their breath. It was an experimental jet, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Smooth as glass, fast as a bullet, built not by order of a dictator, but by a team of engineers working freely, thinking boldly. One German engineer muttered, "In Berlin, we would need Hitler's signature to build something like this." The American next to him grinned. "In Burbank, we just need a lunch break." Laughter rippled through the hangar. But for the Germans, it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. They were realizing what the war had blinded them to. Innovation doesn't live under tyranny. It dies there. Freedom, the very thing their leaders had mocked, was the fuel that powered America's rise. As days turned into weeks, the Germans were given access to more American facilities. Factories where engines were assembled in hours instead of days. Testing labs where data was analyzed by early computers, not by men with pencils. Production lines where women and men worked side by side. Efficient, precise, unafraid. Everywhere they looked, there was energy. Not forced labor. Not fear. Just drive. And with each discovery, their pride cracked a little more. In Germany, engineers had begged for nickel, copper, tungsten, the metals needed to make engines last longer. But the Reich's obsession with tanks and V-weapons had starved them. They were told to make do, to innovate with scraps, to keep the miracle going no matter the cost. In America, the same engineers found warehouses filled with mountains of materials. Rows of engines ready for testing. Trucks loaded with spare parts that could have supplied the entire Luftwaffe for months. One German turned to a U.S. officer and asked, How can you afford this?" The officer shrugged. "We can't afford not to." That simple answer haunted them. Because while Germany had sacrificed everything for domination, America had built strength through cooperation, not just between soldiers but between citizens, scientists, and industry. And nowhere was that unity more visible than in the Skunk Works, Lockheed's top-secret division hidden behind plane factory doors. When the Germans were allowed a glimpse inside, they expected a military fortress, guards, secrets, shouting officers. Instead, they found coffee cups, laughter, and engineers in shirt sleeves arguing passionately over blueprints. Clarence Kelly Johnson, the man behind many of Lockheed's miracles, walked right up to them and shook their hands. No arrogance, no fear, just curiosity. He listened as they described their wartime jet research, and then calmly explained how his team had already solved those same problems years earlier. With better metals, better math, better freedom. And that's when one of the German engineers said something extraordinary. He turned to his colleagues and whispered in German, "We thought we were gods. But these men, these free men, they are the future." In the following months, something began to change. The Germans stopped seeing themselves as captives. They became collaborators, quiet, eager, and humbled. They worked alongside American teams on high-altitude flight, on supersonic aerodynamics, on the next generation of engines that would one day power the jet age. And yet, deep down, they couldn't escape one haunting question. How had America done it? How had a nation so young, so seemingly chaotic, built an industrial machine that outpaced the most disciplined regime in history? The answer, they would learn, wasn't in steel or fuel or factories. It was in people. America didn't force its citizens to serve. It inspired them to. It didn't silence its thinkers. It let them argue, dream, and experiment. And from that chaos came brilliance. One German scientist later wrote in his diary, "We had the science. They had the spirit. And spirit wins wars." When the Americans finally tested one of their new turbojet engines, the Germans stood quietly in the observation room. The engine roared to life, a deep, steady thunder that rattled the glass. No smoke, no stutter, no flameout. It was perfect, reliable, American. And as that sound echoed across the desert, they knew they were hearing more than power. They were hearing the future. A future they had once dreamed of, but would never own. For years, they had believed they were the world's teachers. But here, in these hangars and labs, they had become the students. And America, The land they had called naive and weak was now teaching the world how to fly. The war had ended. The smoke of Europe was still thick, the cities still silent, and the world was rebuilding itself from the ashes. But inside a few quiet airbases in America, something remarkable was happening. The German engineers, once enemies, were now working side by side with the very nation they had tried to destroy. For the Americans, it wasn't about revenge. It was about progress. They didn't see prisoners, they saw potential. One of the youngest engineers, Klaus Meyer, stood by the window one evening, watching the sunset over the California hills. He whispered to himself, "In Germany, we built for survival. Here, they build for tomorrow." Those words summed up everything. Because while Germany's wartime scientists had been driven by fear of failure, fear of their leaders, American engineers were driven by hope, by ambition, by curiosity, and that difference changed everything. Within months, the German teams were contributing to projects that would define the next century. Jet propulsion, supersonic flight, high-altitude testing, even early rocket research. The Americans had a name for it: Operation Paperclip. To the public, it didn't exist. To history, it would become one of the most important scientific alliances ever made. Through it, men like Wernher von Braun, the brilliant, controversial mind behind Germany's V-2 rockets, were brought to America not as prisoners but as partners. They had once built weapons for destruction. Now they would build engines for the stars. But not all were ready to accept that. In Washington, debates raged. "How can we trust the men who built weapons for Hitler?" one senator asked. Another replied, and so the captured scientists were moved into new facilities, secure but comfortable. Workshops filled with machines more advanced than anything they'd known. Blueprints spread across long tables. Engines half-assembled, waiting for hands that could make them roar. One German engineer later wrote in his journal, "America did not chain us. They challenged us." The challenge was simple: help the United States understand what Germany had learned, and in return see what America had already built. At first, many were skeptical. They thought they'd be treated as tools, interrogated, discarded. But instead, they found something they'd never experienced before: freedom. They were encouraged to think, to question, to create. One morning, an American colonel walked into the lab and saw a German team struggling with a turbine design. He leaned over their table and said casually, "Try it your way. If it blows up, we'll build another." The room went silent. In Germany, such failure would have meant punishment, even death. Here, it meant progress. Slowly, the fear faded, and curiosity returned. They began to see how America's industrial power wasn't just about machines. It was about mentality. Here, engineers were treated like explorers, not soldiers. Mistakes weren't buried, they were studied. Every failure was a step toward something better. And as they watched, they realized this was how innovation was supposed to work. Because they know how, and we can show them why. And that was the difference. In Germany, they had built for power. In America, they would build for purpose. Inside the test facilities, the collaboration deepened. The Germans taught what they knew: how to squeeze thrust from limited fuel, how to shape air intakes, how to calculate drag at transonic speeds. The Americans, in turn, showed them how to build better, faster, safer. They taught them about alloys that didn't melt at high temperatures, about precision manufacturing, about something called reliability. To the Germans, that word was new. During the war, reliability had been sacrificed for speed. Engines were pushed out before they were ready. Designs were rushed to the front lines. Failure was hidden. But in America, reliability was everything. An engine wasn't ready until it could run for hundreds of hours, not just minutes. A design wasn't finished until it could be trusted by a pilot's life. And as they watched American test pilots climb into cockpits, they understood that trust was the true foundation of progress. Every morning, the roar of jet engines filled the air, a thunder that echoed across the desert, shaking the hangars and vibrating through the ground. For the Germans, it was the sound of redemption. They were no longer building weapons for conquest. They were building dreams for flight, for space, for peace. Still, some nights, memories crept back. The sound of air raids, the flash of burning cities, the faces of men who never came home. They wondered if this new path could ever erase what they had done. But then, they would walk back into the hangar the next morning and see something extraordinary. Young American engineers working side by side with them, laughing, learning, unafraid. They saw no hatred, only curiosity, only progress. And in that moment, they began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was their second chance. It wasn't long before the collaboration bore fruit. By 1947, the Americans had achieved something no one else had. They had broken the sound barrier. The Bell X-1, flown by Chuck Yeager, roared past Mach 1 in a blaze of thunder and orange flame. Every German scientist in the observation room stood frozen, staring at the instruments as the needle crossed that impossible line. Silence filled the room, and then applause, hesitant at first, then unstoppable, because they all knew what it meant. Mankind had just shattered one of nature's final limits. Later, one German engineer said quietly, "This is what we dreamed of, but we could never reach it. Now we helped make it happen." For the first time, they didn't feel like defeated men. They felt like part of something bigger, something human. And yet, as they celebrated, America was already looking beyond the sky. Rocket technology, once a German secret, was now the foundation of a new race. The United States wanted not just to fly, but to leave the Earth. And with the dawn of the Cold War, that dream became a necessity. Because across the ocean, another power was rising, the Soviet Union. And they too had captured German scientists. The race for the future had begun. But this time, the Germans working in America didn't want to build for one nation's glory. They wanted to build for everyone. Von Braun himself once told a young American engineer, "Science should serve mankind, not destroy it." That line would echo through NASA for decades to come. As years passed, the German engineers began to fade from public view. Some became professors. Others retired quietly in small towns across the U.S. But their legacy lived on. In every jet that crossed the sky, in every rocket that reached space, in every dream that dared to fly higher. And though they had once come as prisoners, they left as pioneers. One American pilot who worked with them said years later, "They came here with the ghosts of war, but they gave us the wings of peace." Perhaps that's the greatest victory of all. Not in conquest, not in battle, but in redemption. Because the men who once built the tools of destruction had helped humanity learn how to soar. And as the roar of a new jet engine thundered across the California desert one last time, those who stood there watching knew this was no longer the sound of war. It was the sound of the future. The war that once split the world in two had finally ended. The guns were silent. But inside America's laboratories, in places like White Sands, New Mexico, and later, Cape Canaveral, a new kind of thunder was beginning to rise. Not the thunder of bombs, but the thunder of dreams. Because the same engineers who had once built weapons for destruction were now building engines for exploration. And among them stood men who carried the weight of two worlds. Men who had seen both the worst and the best that humanity could create. For them, this was no longer about nations. It was about purpose. The skies, once filled with fire, were now quiet again. Wernher von Braun, once the architect of Germany's V-2 rocket, now stood in an American uniform, pointing toward the sky. His dream had always been the same, to reach the stars. But for the first time, it wasn't for conquest. It was for curiosity. He looked at his team, Germans and Americans working side by side, and said, "The rocket will carry not soldiers, but scientists. Not warheads, but hope." Those words would become the foundation of NASA. Because when the Cold War began, the race for space wasn't just a contest of power. It was a contest of ideas. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a tiny sphere of metal that beeped across the night sky, and suddenly the world changed. For a moment, America felt behind. The shock was enormous. The newspapers screamed, "Russians beat US into space." But in the quiet halls of Huntsville, Alabama, A team of engineers didn't panic. They planned. They had seen this before, the feeling of being outpaced, outbuilt. And they knew how to answer it. With science. With teamwork. With freedom. Von Braun gathered his team and told them, "The Soviets may have gone first, but we will go farther." And they did. From those long days and sleepless nights came the Saturn rockets, giants of steel and flame, each one capable of lifting dreams beyond Earth's reach. When the first test firing shook the ground in 1961, the engineers stood in awe. The sound was like the heartbeat of a planet. One American technician turned to his German colleague and said, "You used to build rockets that fell on London. Now we build them to touch the moon." The German smiled softly. "And that," he said, "is why I came here, because this was redemption." Every launch was a statement to the world that progress could rise from the ruins of war, that knowledge could be reborn as peace. And then came a moment that would define all of history. A black sky above the sea of tranquility. A human voice crackled through the radio. "That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind." When Neil Armstrong placed his foot on lunar dust, millions of people around the world cheered. But in one quiet control room in Houston, a group of older men simply stared at the screen in silence. They weren't cheering. They were remembering. Remembering the cities they had once destroyed. The friends they had lost, the choices that had brought them here, and then slowly they smiled, because they realized that this moment was their second chance fulfilled. The machines they had once built for death had now carried life farther than it had ever gone before. One of the German engineers wrote later in his diary, "When I saw the rocket leave Earth, I felt the weight of my sins lift. For the first time, the fire we created did not burn, it illuminated. That was the final victory, not over enemies, but over the past. Because the truth is, no empire, no ideology, no flag lasts forever. But ideas do. And the idea that freedom creates power, that innovation comes from trust, not terror, that idea outlasted them all." Years later, when the Apollo program ended, many of those German engineers faded quietly into American life. They became teachers, mentors, fathers, neighbors. They built schools, libraries, communities, and their children spoke English, not German, because they had found a new home, not of soil, but of spirit. In interviews decades later, von Braun was asked if he regretted his past. He paused for a long time, then said, "I regret that we used science for destruction, but I am grateful that America showed me it could be used for discovery." It wasn't just his story. It was the story of an entire generation. Men who crossed from darkness into light. They had once stood beneath the falling ruins of Berlin. Now they stood beneath the rising rockets of Cape Kennedy. And in that journey lay one of the greatest transformations in human history. Because when those German engineers stepped onto American soil after the war, they thought they were entering the land of their conquerors. Instead, they found the land of their teachers. America didn't just defeat them. It redeemed them. It taught them that power without purpose is meaningless. That science without conscience is dangerous. And that freedom, true freedom, is the greatest engine mankind will ever build. Today, every satellite that circles the Earth, every probe that travels to Mars, every astronaut who floats in the silence of space, carries within that legacy. A legacy born not from hate, but from healing. And maybe that is the lesson history tried to teach all along. That humanity's greatest weapon is not war. It's wonder. The same minds that once built destruction, built discovery. The same hands that once launched rockets in rage, launched them in hope. And in that transformation, the German engineers, the prisoners of a lost cause, helped humanity find its future. As the last of them passed away, one was asked what he thought when he saw rockets still flying, still breaking barriers, still reaching beyond the stars. He smiled and said, "When I see them rise, I see proof that even the darkest past can lead to the brightest horizon. Because in the end, this was never just a story about war. It was a story about rebirth. About men who came to America defeated and left the world forever changed. The sound of their rockets no longer echoes with fear. It echoes with hope. And somewhere, high above the earth, beyond clouds and borders, beyond nations and flags, the dream they built together still flies, a whisper in the stars that says, "We were once enemies. Now we are explorers."